Gamers have long had to put up with intrusive DRMs like SecureROM, Starforce, Arxan, and more recently Denuvo, all for the sake of delaying piracy. However, even the harshest of these have only managed to delay piracy, and none of them have ever completely prevented a cracked release. The only one that has managed to achieve that feat is by far the most intrusive, restrictive, and above all the most anti-consumer practice in the industry: Always Online DRM. While it does stop pirates from playing the game, it eventually but inevitably does the same to buyers who paid for the game. It's just a matter of time. This is not conjecture. Always Online DRM has already rendered several games permanently unplayable, which is the fate destined for any game that requires a persistent connection. This video explores the history of this practice and how resistant to piracy each game that used it has been. But first, let's explore what Always Online DRM is and how it works. Always Online DRM is not an additional layer of protection added to the game post-development like Denuvo or Arxan, but rather a restriction built into the game's design by the developers. Some might call Denuvo an always-on DRM, as it has been reported to deny buyers access to their games when their connection goes down. This tells us always-on DRM exists on a spectrum of game design practices which can be classified into 3 tiers: periodic activation, continuous authentication, and offloaded server-side code. Denuvo appears to be using periodic activation as one of its many measures, as evidenced by the fact that buyers need to log in every few days to authenticate their games. What sets it apart from Always Online DRM is that Denuvo may or may not stop your game immediately if you lose your internet connection. This has spawned an exploit where buyers exchange accounts to authenticate a game the other has paid for, then turn Steam offline after they have been authorized. This seems like the digital equivalent of sharing used game discs like Sony advertised for PlayStation 4. However, this bypass is temporary, as Denuvo will require them to authenticate online again at some point. But this is the case for everyone who has bought the game. Consequently, everyone suffers when Denuvo's activation servers fail, as the authentication requirement makes no allowances for this inevitable scenario. Case in point, problems with Denuvo servers prevented legitimate buyers from playing Batman Arkham Knight, Mad Max, and Shadow of War, as they couldn't reach the authentication server to activate their legitimate copies. Pirates, meanwhile, were unaffected by the outage, as all of these games have been cracked at this point by a scene group that has managed to emulate these activations offline with their cracks. Nevertheless, this outage provides a glimpse of what is to come when Denuvo's servers shut down for good, as buyers will have no way to play the games they paid for if no crack is available for the games in question. While that sounds horrible enough, let's move on to a practice that's even worse: continuous authentication. Games that require continuous authentication will kick you out of a game mid-session if your internet connection goes down. How long it will take to lock you out depends on the implementation used, and as such varies from game to game. For instance, Assassin's Creed 2 was reported to stop 5 seconds after disconnection, while Kotaku managed to play Simcity offline for about 19 minutes before encountering problems stemming from the always-on DRM. Game companies often justify implementing this draconian measure by insisting their game is better off for its online services. But the excuses never hold up to scrutiny. For instance, the developers of 2015's Need for Speed insisted their game needed to be online as it was a social experience that rewarded players for sharing their screenshots. We are paraphrasing here. We'll get into detail with direct quotes later. Nevertheless, we fail to see why this precluded the ability to play offline, as previous Need for Speed titles have had robust multiplayer without imposing always online requirements. This seems like a thinly veiled excuse to disguise this intrusive DRM as a legitimate requirement for a critical game feature. The DRM itself has been highly successful in this case, as Need for Speed hasn't yet been cracked, and probably will never be as long as the game still needs to connect to the developer's servers. On that note, we wonder how long the buyers will get to play the game for, given EA's proclivity to shut servers down a few years after the title's release. It is highly unlikely that the game will be patched to work offline to keep the game playable for buyers, as was the case with Darkspore, another always-online title that is now completely and permanently unplayable after its servers were shut down. Going back to Need for Speed, the fact that the developer felt the need to deny the DRM's true purpose tells us that Always Online DRM has become anathema to customers to the point that companies can no longer call it what it is, and instead need to pass it off as a multiplayer requirement even for games that are primarily single-player experiences. Maxis, the studio behind 2013 Simcity, is another developer that required their customers to be always online to play their game. Consequently, the game's launch was crippled by technical issues brought on by their servers' inadequacy. This would never have happened had they not required their customers to be constantly connected to their servers. So what was their justification for doing so? An online interconnected world has been part of our design philosophy since day one. It's the game that we've been wanting to create since SimCity 4, as we've wanted to explore the dynamics between cities as they exist within regions. Real cities don't exist in bubbles. They specialise and trade resources, workers, and more. With the way that the game works, we offload a significant amount of the calculations to our servers so that the computations are off the local PCs and are moved into the cloud. This brings us to the third principle of Always Online DRM, delivering an incomplete game to the customers that relies on the developer's servers for crucial gameplay functions. The scene cannot crack an incomplete game, as scene rules require any cracked release function identically to the legitimate version. This is impossible with incomplete games as the code the game needs to function is stored on the developer's servers and cannot be obtained, only observed and imitated. At best, the back-end code can be mimicked using server emulators, but this does not match the legitimate experience to the degree required by scene standards and is thus left to groups within the wider peer-to-peer community. Even here, piracy is scarce as only the largest titles like World of Warcraft have been emulated. It should be noted that Always Online need not be a requirement for any game, even multiplayer titles. Games that are primarily multiplayer experiences like Rainbow Six Siege can still be played offline in LAN sessions. This is a polar opposite of Always Online DRM, where LAN preserves multiplayer games in perpetuity. Always Online DRM is guaranteed to kill single-player games when the company pulls the plug. So what was the origin of this reprehensible practice? Ubisoft was the first publisher to incorporate Always Online DRM as a standard feature in their games, beginning with Silent Hunter V: Battle of the Atlantic, a submarine simulator that launched on March 2, 2010, followed 2 days later by Assassin's Creed 2. One outlet had this to say about DRM. If you get disconnected while playing, you're booted out of the game. All your progress since the last checkpoint or save game is lost, and your only options are to quit to Windows or to wait until you're reconnected. This happens even if the game loses its connection to Ubisoft's master servers on their end. Buyers were faced with this scenario less than a week after Silent Hunter V's release, as the DRM servers went down days after launch, rendering the game unplayable for anyone who bought it. It was a different story for pirates. Skid Row released a crack for Silent Hunter V on March 3rd, the day after the game's release. However, Ubisoft denied its DRM had failed and stated the cracked version was incomplete. Ubisoft's claim was later validated by Skid Row's rival, Vitality, who released their proper crack for the game in July 2010, 132 days after the game launched. This is what they had to say in the NFO accompanying their release. Skid Row previously released Silent Hunter V with the first of Ubisoft's new DRM shown to the gaming world. While this first attempt at cracking the new protection, it seemed to work at first, but soon you will notice that you can't advance through the game campaigns. The game stays in this frozen-like state, so no matter what you do, it will remain unchanged. You can't complete your objectives and then gain new ones, like you should, which makes this game unplayable at the time and needing a proper crack. Vitality is here to present an alternative crack to this new protection, one which doesn't require server emulation and allows you full access to the game's features. Ubisoft later quietly introduced an offline mode in early 2011, several months late in our opinion, as we feel they should have removed online requirements as soon as a proper crack was released in July 2010. From this point on, legitimate buyers were dealing with an inferior experience to pirates who could play the game unhindered by the quality of their internet. And that concludes the journey of Ubisoft's first Always Online game. Let's move on to the second, Assassin's Creed 2. Assassin's Creed 2 arrived just days after Silent Hunter V and suffered similarly from the outage affecting Ubisoft's DRM servers. Buyers will be locked out of the game 5 seconds after losing connection to the aforementioned servers, no matter what the culprit was, the user's internet connection or Ubisoft servers. These problems also plague the next title that Ubisoft forced this DRM on. On March 23rd, Settlers 7 launched with what was now Ubisoft's signature Always Online restrictions and predictably ran into server issues in the first week of April. Ubisoft were forced to release a statement addressing this issue. Settlers 7 players have encountered difficulties playing the game over the Easter holiday weekend due to issues with servers that do matchmaking in multiplayer mode and that keep track of profiles, campaign progression and stats in both solo and multi modes. Meanwhile, there was a development with Assassin's Creed 2 around this time as a group named Dormine released a server emulator 1 month after the game's release. This bypass required pirates to edit their host file to block the game from connecting to Ubisoft servers, then run the server emulator to feed the game the information it needed to function. This emulator was referenced by Skid Row when they released the first scene crack for Assassin's Creed 2 on 21st of April 2010, 48 days after the game's release. This is what Skid Row said in their NFO. We know that there is a server emulator out in the open, which makes the game playable, but when you look at our cracked content, you will know that it can't be compared to that. Our work does not construct any program deviation or any kind of host file paradox solutions. Install game and copy the cracked content. It's that simple. Though Skid Row differentiated their crack from Dormine's emulator on the simplicity and ease of use, their crack was alleged to have been derived from Dormine's work. Skid Row responded to these accusations in a subsequent NFO. We noticed our release was nuked a few places for using stolen public available values.vb codes. Let's point out that even if our DLL has the very same values, then anyone can get these values and the values are still required to emulate the UBI Orbit API calls. The data values are transferred via IPC, as we didn't use any kind of server emulation at all and therefore can't be compared to the public server emulator out there. Dormine didn't take kindly to being sidelined like this and responded with a statement that accused Skid Row of stealing their work. Skid Row didn't bother responding to Dormine, though they did have a message for Ubisoft. Thank you, Ubisoft. This was quite a challenge for us, but nothing stops the leading force from doing what we do. Next time, focus on the game and not on the DRM. It was probably horrible for all legit users. We just make their lives easier. A couple of days later, Razer cracked Settlers 7 on 27th of April 2010, 35 days after the game launched. Razer used this opportunity to rant about Skid Row in their release note. As far as previous cracks of Ubisoft's new DRM system are concerned, both of Skid Row's releases show us they haven't had a look, probably even didn't find, the actual protection code, and everything hints on them using parts of publicly collected challenge response pairs. Luckily, Assassin's Creed 2 is probably the only target ever where this approach of emulating the server by a static lookup will yield any measurable success due to a basic design flaw in an otherwise pretty neat idea of software protection. In fact, we considered this approach as generally too unreliable and unworthy of a scene crack, so we didn't care about doing it. Instead, we opted for going for the arguably most challenging implementation of Ubisoft's new DRM first, emulating actual server-side game code. So here it is, the first Ubisoft DRM crack. 2 days after this, Splinter Cell Conviction launched on April 29th and was cracked by Skid Row the very next day. Skid Row used this release to respond to Razer. Razer 1911. You took the liberty to use bigger words than you can handle. You obviously haven't even looked at our Assassin's Creed 2 crack. You judge our Assassin's Creed 2 crack by reading public boards and fake NFOs with fake content really made you look non-worthy to use a Blade's group name. It's so obvious that you're not the sharpest blade in the drawer. Claiming you were the first to crack the new Ubisoft protection is just so ridiculous, so much actually, that we're in fact still laughing since you released Settlers 7. You even praise the new Ubisoft DRM, as it apparently to you gives the scene a chance for redemption to bring back the good old days of real cracking. You're so full of bullshit with that Settlers 7 NFO that you're starting to sound like Reloaded. For the people with no cracking knowledge, then we will explain a few things about the Ubisoft DRM. A. Ubisoft DRM can't even be compared with protections of the good old days. B. Razer's crack isn't really any different from our Assassin's Creed 2 crack. It's the emulated data that makes the difference. C. Razer just moved the Ubisoft launcher into the main folder of the Settlers 7 game and patched it to work from there. D. To make these cracks work correctly, you still have to gather and emulate the data that are being sent-received from the communication between the game and your PC. The cracking method is still the same for each title. It's the handling of the data being sent-received between the Ubisoft servers and the decryption methods of it. That takes time to do properly. The next day, Skid Row released a multiplayer crack for Conviction that used an account registered with Ubisoft's own website. This release, coupled with the fact it wasn't nuked, proves the theory we made in our last video that the scene groups are free to crack multiplayer. For more information, be sure to watch Multiplayer Piracy Explained right after you finish this video. The next Ubisoft title to require a constant internet connection was Prince of Persia: Forgotten Sands, which launched on June 12, 2010. 14 days later, Skid Row released a crack on the 26th of June and described the details of the DRM's implementation in their NFO. The way the Ubisoft DRM works makes it so that every game is like a brand new challenge. What it does do is offload certain parts of the game to a server. The game then requests those things at runtime. These parts could be anything that the developer wants. In the case of Prince of Persia: The Forgotten Sands, those things were levers logic, door timing, upgrades, abilities, XP and levels, area code. Every time you step on a button in-game, it sends a request to server asking what to do. Server then sends a door code to open, including how much time it stays open. Levers work similarly. Every time you press the tab button to display skills, game asks again server, what skills do player have? And so on and on. All that stuff takes a lot of time to implement right, and we do implement it like the original do. All our doors open and close with exact same time factors as the retail do. We just wanted to clarify a little how the Ubisoft DRM really does work, because a lot of these individuals we mentioned in the beginning of this statement didn't seem to understand yet what kind of monster this is. It's not some simply values going around like it were with Assassin's Creed 2. Skid Row wouldn't crack the next Ubisoft game that used Always Online DRM, Hawks 2, released on November 12, 2010. Hawks 2 resisted piracy for over 2 years before finally falling to Tiny ISO on 19th of February 2013, 830 days since the game's launch. The game was cracked 8 days after Ubisoft patched it to work offline on February 11th, 2013. Make of that what you will. On April 26, 2011, EA studio Maxis released Darkspore, a sequel to 2008's Spore that required players to be connected to their servers at all times. Electronic Arts told Destructoid that this is not intended as DRM, but as part of the experience. According to the publisher, even if you're playing a single-player game, your loot and experience need to be sent to EA's online servers for use with co-op and PvP, while PC players are still upset over the restrictions. EA is adamant it's a required part of the experience. It is ironic that the article concludes with the statement, "This won't affect the majority of PC gamers who are likely always online anyway." This restriction spelled doom for the game when EA shut down the servers in 2016, less than 5 years after the game launched. Of course, no allowance was made for the players who bought the game. No patch was released to allow offline play for the buyers who paid for the game. But look on the bright side. The game was never cracked. That's what matters, right? The next Ubisoft title to use Always Online DRM was From Dust, which launched on 17th of August and was cracked by Skid Row on 19th of August, 2 days after the game launched. 3 days after the crack was released, the developers announced they would patch the game to eliminate any need for online authentication and delivered the promised update in September. Despite this, Ubisoft still implemented Always On DRM in their next PC release, Driver San Francisco, although they tweaked it to authenticate only upon launch, after which the game could be played offline. This didn't help as Skid Row cracked the game on the 24th of September. In an interview with Eurogamer, founding developer of Ubisoft Reflections stated he had no control over what DRM was used. The publisher made that call. Nevertheless, he insisted the publisher has every right to protect their investment, later going on to say, "Piracy on the PC is utterly unbelievable. You have to do something. It's just, simply, PC piracy is at the most incredible rates. This game cost a huge amount of money to develop, and it has to be, quite rightly, quite morally correctly, protected. If there was very little trouble with piracy, then we wouldn't need it." Next up was Might and Magic Heroes 6, which Skid Row cracked on 12th of October 2011, 1 day before its official release on the 13th of October. About the game's implementation of DRM, here's what a reviewer at GameSpy had to say. "The real killjoy and potential deal-breaker is the horrendous Uplay system's draconian requirement that you be connected to the internet at all times to play. Let me be clear. Heroes 6 is an absolute nightmare if you have a spotty internet connection. Sure, connecting to the Conflux, as it's called, gives you access to some very cool features like dynasty weapons, special perks, networking, and stat tracking, but it comes at a high price. If your internet connection drops out mid-game, you're booted back to the main menu, sometimes forcing you to lose massive amounts of progress in the process. This happened to me numerous times during lengthy campaign maps, and when I couldn't immediately reconnect, I was essentially locked out of my campaign. The next Ubisoft title to require a permanent internet connection was Anno 2070, which launched on 17th November 2011 and was cracked by Reloaded on the 26th, just 9 days after the game's release. However, Ubisoft has still not patched the game to work offline, and legitimate buyers continue to suffer the consequences. The most recent incident occurred in February 2018, when buyers were locked out of Anno 2070 completely and were unable to access its single player due to authentication issues with Ubisoft's DRM servers. Pirates were of course unaffected by this outage, continuing to demonstrate the fact that DRM hurts buyers far more than it deters pirates. Thankfully, Ubisoft declared in 2012 that they were ditching Always Online, instead requiring a one-time authentication during game installation, following which single player could be played offline. This was more of a temporary respite, as we'll see later. For now, let's move on to other publishers. Blizzard built Diablo 3 to require a persistent connection to their servers, even for single player, which led to widespread connectivity problems in the days following the game's launch, as the servers couldn't cope with the demand. This locked large sections of the player base out of the game entirely. Even when players could connect to the server, they reported lag while playing solo. Latency should not even be a factor in single player, yet Blizzard managed to make it one. But look at the silver lining. Diablo 3 has not been cracked. There was once a server emulator named Moo Egg, but that was no proper crack. Of course, Blizzard have argued that Diablo 3's requirement of a connection is not about DRM, but about improving the player's experience. Yet, offline play is available on all console versions, along with 4-player local co-op. We wonder why Blizzard hasn't improved console players' experience by requiring a persistent connection to their servers. In 2013, Max's Simcity was met with universal condemnation for the issues caused by its Always Online requirement. Polygon, an outlet that initially praised the game and rewarded it with a score of 9.5, later dropped their score to 8, and then to 4 in light of the rampant connectivity failures that rendered the game unplayable. They did, however, later raise the score back up to 6.5 after the issue subsided. Destructoid was even harsher with their score of 4, and they minced no words as to why. The fact that the online portion of the game is broken makes it a complete nightmare. Over the past few days since launch, I've spent a good chunk of time trying to connect online. If I did manage to connect, the game would have issues interacting with other cities in my region, and sometimes I would lose entire cities due to things failing to be saved correctly. The constant DRM is an annoyance, but the real issue here is the fact that everything is happening online. It's a decent game if it worked right, but the online dependency, forced multiplayer and DRM ruin it. However, Maxis general manager Lucy Bradshaw insisted that Always Connected didn't come down as an order from corporate, and it isn't a clandestine strategy to control players. It's fundamental to the vision we had for this SimCity. From the ground up, we designed this game with multiplayer in mind. In many ways, we built an MMO. This is an interesting yet implausible excuse that would later be adopted by other companies to justify using the same DRM in their games. But more on that in a moment. Let's return to Max's statement. So, could we have built a subset offline mode? Yes, but we rejected that idea because it didn't fit with our vision. Bradshaw had earlier expressed a similar statement in an interview with Kotaku. A significant portion of the Glassbox engine's calculations are performed on our servers and off of the players' PCs. It would take a significant amount of engineering work from our team to rewrite the game so that all of those functions are calculated locally without a significant performance hit to the player. However, Rock Paper Shotgun got in touch with an insider at Maxis who refuted these claims. It wouldn't take very much engineering to give you a limited single-player game without all the nifty region stuff. The servers are not handling any of the computation done to simulate the city you are playing. They are still acting as servers, doing some amount of computation to route messages of various types between both players and cities. As well, they're doing cloud storage of save games, interfacing with Origin and all that. But for the game itself? No. They're not doing anything. History proved the insider right as 10 months later, Maxis introduced with Update 10 a single-player mode that could run offline. After all was said and done, how does Simcity do with piracy? Had the DRM accomplished its purpose? There was no crack for Simcity while the persistent connection requirement was still in place. With that said, the introduction of offline mode was not immediately followed by a crack. Instead, pirates had to wait another 71 days for Razer's crack of SimCity and its expansion, Cities of Tomorrow, both of which were cracked on March 24, 2014. In 2014, Ubisoft returned to imposing always online restrictions with The Crew. Unlike Diablo 3, The Crew is always online, both on PC and consoles. When asked in a 2013 pre-release interview whether this was because The Crew relied on cloud computing, a producer working on the title stated the whole game played off the disc. How then did he justify requiring a persistent connection? Our approach to that is this is a living world, he said. We don't really see the point of offline. I can help you there. The point of offline is to ensure buyers have a way to play the game after you pull the plug on your servers. But you were saying, did you ever play World of Warcraft? So, World of Warcraft you don't play offline. It doesn't mean you can't play by yourself. When I played World of Warcraft, I played it for about 12 months, single player only, without talking to anyone. That's our approach. When asked what would happen to players who get disconnected while they were playing, this is what he said. They won't be able to save the game, unfortunately. All our saves are server-based. It's one of those things that this new generation, it's just like World of Warcraft. If the internet connection goes on World of Warcraft, that's it. Your save game goes. It's one of the unfortunate side effects, but I think we're going to a world where the experiences demand that. Who demanded an always online experience? 1 year before this interview, Ubisoft had this to say about Always Online DRM in an interview with Rock Paper Shotgun. We have listened to feedback, and since June last year, our policy for all of PC games is that we only require a one-time online activation when you first install the game. And from then, you are free to play the game offline. We've obviously heard from PC customers that they were unhappy with some of the policies that we had in place. And that's why we're looking to make these changes, why we have been implementing these changes. By Ubisoft's own admission, customer feedback demanded the ability to play offline, a demand for the opposite of what they then implemented in The Crew. The producer even emphasized that the single-player story can be played all by yourself, as long as you have an internet connection. It just becomes that much more interesting if you're connected and the world around you is living, with other drivers and potential encounters. We can comfortably call rubbish on this, having played The Crew ourselves. The Crew is no different from any other open-world racing game, apart from being labelled an MMO in a feeble attempt by Ubisoft to justify forcing Always Online DRM onto customers. The DRM has done its job as The Crew has not yet been cracked, and probably will never be. However, what is the point of staving off piracy after Ubisoft gave the game away for free? The only purpose the persistent connection requirement now serves is to deprive buyers of the game they've paid for. We call on Ubisoft to patch an offline mode into the game. If not immediately, then at least before they shut the servers down like they did with World in Conflict. 1 year after the launch of The Crew, EA released in 2015 a reboot for Need for Speed that inexplicably required players to be connected to their servers at all times. When asked about the reason behind imposing this requirement, executive producer Marcus Nilsson had this to say. It will treat your friend's play as if it's part of the narrative experience. We also have a new Snapshot System as well, which is taking pictures of a lot of different moments out to the Need for Speed network, where people can like them, and those likes are being pushed back into the game as currency. So you get progression from sharing your photos, Nilsson added. Did anybody ask for this? Is there a single gamer who thinks this is worth risking the game turning permanently unplayable when EA inevitably shuts the servers down like they did with Battleforge? Ghost Games has seen how EA killed Battleforge in 2013 with a server shutdown, and yet they built the same kill switch into Need for Speed. Perhaps the fact that their game has not yet been cracked makes this worth it to them, but we doubt their customers see it the same way. The next game on our list, 2016's Hitman, wasn't quite as bad as it could be played offline, though the experience will be severely impacted without a connection to the developer's servers. Saves created while connected would not work in offline mode, meaning items unlocked while connected would not be available when offline, players who bought Hitman complained that they would get kicked back to the main menu if their connection failed in the midst of a mission. Developer IO Interactive said this was intentional, as Hitman was a live game, going on to say, "This is a constantly evolving, living world of assassination that will grow alongside the community with frequent content updates in between the launch of each location. This live content includes new contracts, escalation contracts, elusive targets, and even additional challenges. It is possible to enjoy the locations offline, but in order to ensure player progress of the live content is correct and up to date, the save states for online and offline are kept separate." The game was later patched to allow players to use unlocks made online in offline mode, though players still needed to be online to acquire new unlocks. This had curious repercussions for pirates, as the cracked version cannot unlock weapons and gear, though a save file that unlocks everything has been made available, effectively skipping the game's progression system. There was only one game released in 2017 that required a persistent connection even for single player: For Honor. This was Ubisoft's justification for imposing this requirement. Some elements of progression, which is hosted online, are shared across story and multiplayer modes. Players will need to be connected to the internet at all times to play For Honor. While For Honor's single player is lackluster and not worth writing home about, hero training is useful and players would have appreciated being able to test new heroes while they were offline. As it stands, the game is completely unplayable when the servers go down for maintenance, which does not inspire confidence in the game's longevity should Ubisoft shut the servers down permanently, as they did with World in Conflict. Though that was not an always online title, and thus only its multiplayer was killed by the shutdown. While World in Conflict's multiplayer was brought back to life by a fan project, the game was already cracked well before then. For Honor, on the other hand, has not yet been cracked. But we don't see why this matters, as Ubisoft gave the starter edition away for free a while ago. What benefit could Ubisoft possibly derive from keeping For Honor always online? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. 2018 has seen the release of two games that require a persistent connection: The Crew 2 and Hitman 2, both of them taking after their predecessors. While Hitman 2 can be played offline, players cannot progress or unlock items when they are not connected to the developer's servers. The Crew 2, meanwhile, does not work at all in offline mode. This seems entirely pointless, as the game can be completed solo without ever interacting with another player. There are even live extreme events that can only be played solo, as you compete against AI drivers and cannot bring your friends into the race. Having events that force players to play alone is ironic in a game that justifies requiring a persistent connection on account of being an MMO. But then again, one could say the entire concept of always online restrictions for single-player games is as ironic as it is reprehensible. To conclude, Always Online DRM succeeds in rendering games unusable, first for pirates and later for legitimate buyers as well. The length of time customers get to use the product they paid for is entirely at the company's discretion. Once the publisher pulls the plug, the game is permanently resigned to history, ensuring nobody will ever get to experience it again. This is the fate that awaits every single game that uses this abhorrent practice. As we said in our eulogy for Lawbreakers, it is always tragic when a game becomes unplayable, no matter how good, bad, or boring it was. Even if you never cared for it, it's an experience you will never get to try again, should you ever feel curious about the game. All you'll have to go by is footage that someone else has recorded of the game, which is nowhere close to playing it yourself. The game will forever be lost to history, when it need not be. The silver lining is that this outcome is preventable, if consumers raise their voices about it. Gamers have influence if rallied, which was proven when EA dropped loot boxes and community-dividing season passes after players raised a stink about it. This video hopes to inspire a similar push against always online restrictions, as it currently holds several titles like Titanfall hostage. We hope you will share this video to raise awareness of this, if not for any of the games we just talked about, then for a game you do care about. That concludes our analysis of Always Online DRM. If you found this video interesting, please share it to spread the word. There is more content like this in the works, so please like, subscribe, and press the bell button so you don't miss out. You may have noticed our closing statement was nearly identical to the one we used to conclude our Lawbreakers video, and there is a reason for that. Lawbreakers' requirement for a persistent connection was the cause of its death, as the developer made no provision for players to connect to each other that didn't depend on the Doom server. Some might argue that multiplayer games need to be connected to a server by the nature of their design, but this is incorrect. Our video on Lawbreakers details how multiplayer games have been preserved well after the shutdown of their developers' servers. So be sure to watch that if you haven't already. Link is in the description and on the screen. While you're at it, feel free to watch our playlist on Denuvo's history and performance impact and our hardware analysis of CPUs and GPUs. Do you play Rainbow Six Siege or Dota 2? Check out the other channel for analytical guides for both games. Link is in the description and on the screen.